last week, INGSA has organised a number of webinars and presentations to replace the biennial meeting which we were due to have in person in Montreal. And in that week, we focused largely on the issues of COVID and how the science advisory mechanism can contribute to making progress against this virus. In a sense, you could argue that COVID is the biggest and unique test of how the global science community and the global policy community at every level from international to local interacts. And there's many lessons to learn from that. And of course, that's what we've been doing in this week of dialogue. Hopefully next year we can actually meet in person in Montreal, and we have made some provisional arrangements for a meeting in late August next year, which we hope that we can still maintain. But we have here today three very important people in the global and multilateral system who can join in a discussion which we've not yet had through this week of dialogue on how the multilateral system looks at the role of science in the way it contributes to policy, and in turn how they might see how member states and might need to look at their own science advisory mechanisms in moving ahead. And we have with us Dr. Shantanu Mukherjee, the Chief of Policy Analysis Branch at the Division of Sustainable Development at UN-DESA, and I'll ask him to introduce himself in a moment. Dr. Shamilla Nair-Bedouelle, who's the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences at UNESCO, which is the primary body, of course, for science within the multilateral system. And we have Tan Zakri bin Abdul Hamid, who is a strong supporter of INGSA. In fact, he's now patron of INGSA in Asia, and he's former science advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, founding chair of IBPES, and formerly a member and chair of the UN Secretary General Science Advisory Board, which Ban Ki-moon had when he was Secretary General. So we're in a position where we can, I think, have some rather interesting discussions on science advice in putting into the multilateral system, which for many scientists, in fact, for most scientists, is a very complex and confusing system about whether the technical aspects of the multilateral system work and where the political aspects of the multilateral system work. So, Shantanu, would you like to just introduce yourself and perhaps talk a little bit about what UN-DESA's role is in the system?
Right. Thanks, Peter. And maybe it's not just the scientists who find the multilateral system to be a bit of a puzzle. So, yes, as you said, I'm with the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And this is primarily the UN's secretariat body based in New York, which helps member states with advice, guidance, and inputs during their discussions and negotiations on the global kind of deliberations that the UN at New York engages in. So more particularly, my work is focused on sustainable development. And it was my unit, for example, but way before my time, that used to help the Commission for Sustainable Development work, that helped frame the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development when it actually came out, and is now entrusted with the substantive guidance for the monitoring and following up to the agenda. And in that capacity, of course, we have a very close relationship with science and scientists. We help bridge the science and policy interface at the high-level political forum, which is the apex review body for the 2030 Agenda. And we also help produce the Global Sustainable Development Report written by an independent group of scientists, implement the technology facilitation mechanism, a special initiative of the General Assembly towards improving how technology and science impact the SDGs, and a bunch of other things. I'm sure many of these things will come up as we engage in this conversation. So thank you for having me here. Over.
And Shamilla, you've been in the role now for, I think, about 18 months. As the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences, you have a very important role in the multilateral system in making sure that, and would you just like to just introduce yourself and make some additional comments about your role and the role of UNESCO in general?
Yes, thank you very much, Peter, and as the Chair of INGSA, thank you for inviting UNESCO to this important dialogue. So I'm the Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences at UNESCO, and probably in the multilateral system, and I can safely say, it is the only UN organization which has an S in its title, and the S stands for the sciences in the broad sense of the word, which means natural sciences as well as the social sciences. Now, 75 years ago of its existence of UNESCO, the guiding principle has been to ensure that we leave no one behind, and we use education, culture, and science to build peace in the minds of men and women. And these are the words of UNESCO's constitution. And I would say that the ink was barely dry on UNESCO's constitution when the organization first foraged into the science world. And the aim was to provide scientific cooperation and collaboration across the world. And this was an aim to reconcile the countries at that time who had been at war. And this intense diplomatic activity also became a technical activity. And so UNESCO's programs aimed to build scientific collaboration, cooperation, reinforce capacities of member states, but also to ensure an integrated scientific research agenda across the world, and its 193 member states. And 75 years on, UNESCO is still promoting this holistic access to science and technology. If we are to reverse the knowledge gap, we have to ensure that development is inclusive, sustainable for humanity as a whole. And therefore, UNESCO's role today, through its international scientific programs, its intergovernmental scientific programs, it's quite, I would say, unique in the UN system. And this international scientific cooperation is arguably more imperative than ever before, especially if we are to reverse the knowledge gap. And we bear witness today to the need for scientific humanism in a troubled world. UNESCO's scientific programs, built over 75 years, aims to promote the international scientific cooperation between all nations across the world and its 193 member states to have access to science for sustainable development beyond 2030. So this is our role at UNESCO, and we are delighted to be part of this discussion and look forward to these the deliberations of today. Thank you for inviting UNESCO.
And I mean, one of the important things I think UNESCO is working on at the moment, Shamilla, is of course the open science agenda, which is critical in this overall discussion. Zakri, do you want to make any introductory remarks?
Yes, I'm delighted and honored to be part of this group discussing about science policy. You know, I'm a student of science diplomacy, and I got in it by accident. 30 years ago, I was asked to be a junior delegate from Malaysia to advise the negotiation on the Convention on Biological Diversity. At the end of the first day, Peter, I walked up to the chief delegation ambassador, and I told her I wanted to go home. And she said, why? Because I couldn't stand this kind of meetings. People were meeting for half an hour and they would adjourn to the delegates room. And she said, give yourself a week. It was 30 years ago. Little did I know then that the dealings and wheelings were being done in those delegates room. So to make a long story short, I've been a member of the delegation. I've also chaired several scientific body of the Convention on Biological Diversity. and also the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services. I was the founding chair. And of course, with Peter, we founded the INGSA in New Zealand in 2014. And we are trying to test out some of those things, the global aspiration to the regional or national level. The ASEAN program that Peter mentioned is one of them. Finally, I just want to stress that this science policy nexus is the last piece of the jigsaw which connect scientific information with the policymakers. So if we don't do it now, we won't have another chance. Thank you.
There's two things in that I'd like to pick up on, actually, and I think that last point that Zakri made is really important. I think what we've seen, INGSA is currently running a policy tracker which is examining over 120 countries exactly how the evidence has been incorporated into policy during the COVID crisis. Now, we're not focused on the decisions that the policy makers made and their consequences, because that's a policy matter, but actually understanding to what extent was there pre-prepared or ad hoc use of mechanisms for the evidence to properly incorporate into those decisions that policymakers must make. I mean, all of us on this call would understand that technocrats alone do not make policy. More than evidence values are very important in policy making. None of us would deny that. But I think what we've seen to date is an enormous variation in the capacity of member states, frankly, to use evidence, to grab the evidence and incorporate into policy. And I think if we look ahead to where I want to now go, which are to the challenges which both Shamilla and Shantanu referred to, the challenges of climate change, of food security, of the socioeconomic impacts and issues of poverty and inequality that the world faces, we're going to have to use the full range of natural and social sciences to get there. And the issue that I really want to ask to comment on, we've had very good assessment processes around climate change with IPCC, very elaborate, very complex, very expensive in terms of their contribution of scientific time that goes into them. Perhaps using a much bigger sledgehammer that is needed at times to make the point. Similarly, IBPES has done the biodiversity surveys. There's these big assessments. But if we put those aside, most of the issues in the SDG, in the sustainability agenda, are not going to need or shouldn't have to need a giant assessment process to make progress on them collectively and in a multilateral setting. Does the UN have ways of appropriately bringing social and natural sciences, medical sciences, data sciences, technological sciences to bear in a way that could bring the same sort of strategic analysis that comes out of those larger assessment processes? Who wants to pick that big question up? Shantanu, I'm looking at you.
Okay, good. It's hard to figure out who's looking at who in this format, but let me give a concrete example. I mean, I do agree with you that the science community has done an enormous job of assessing many of these trends that are alarming, frankly. But I think I also want to highlight two characteristics of these assessments. The first, of course, is that they're focused very much on specific sectors or specialists. Okay. And as a result, I think, which brings me to the second point, it may be relatively easy to build up consensus among experts who speak the same language, and among people who are talking about the same kind of issues, reading the same journals, have studied in the same areas. And this, I think, is actually one of the strengths of these assessments, is that they bring together a scientific consensus that's global, and at the same time sufficiently detailed for countries to see where they are and what they should be doing. I think this is a great strength. But I think here also is something which makes it hard to translate this evidence and knowledge into concrete action on the ground, because most policy making, especially with these big crisis-related issues, is going to be cross-sectoral. And therefore, the evidence that you find relating to climate change or how important it is has to persuade not just the climate scientists or the physical scientists, but the Minister of Finance and the economist and the sociologist. And so I think this is where there is a gap, but I also think this is where we are at the UN, we are working to address the gap. So just as an example, in 2016, member states, not the UN Secretariat, which is more technocratic, but member states, which is much more political, they decided that there would be one report to inform scientific progress towards the SDGs, called the Global Sustainable Report, come out every 4 years. And they also decided that this would be written by an independent cross-disciplinary panel. And I think this was a very important innovation on their part. Let me tell you, as somebody who supports this group, it's not easy to get scientists from different disciplines to talk to each other, let alone agree. But, and it takes a while to get this dialogue going. But I think this member state initiative is an important one. And the first report, which came out last year, actually helped in putting out the scientific evidence that focused on strategic intervention areas among all of the SDGs. And I think that was a brilliant achievement. Of course, there would be people who say that my particular discipline is ill-represented here. But then the moment you start making decisions about what effects will cascade across a whole system and what effects will be confined to smaller parts of the system, some of this becomes, it has to be driven by scientific evidence, but some of this kind of concerns will surface, which is to say that this kind of initiative, which is deliberately cross-disciplinary, but also aims at trying to find a scientific basis for action, is terribly important. And I think we have made a start with this kind of reporting. Over.
Well, as a person who had to peer review the GSDR report, I can say I think Peter Mersley and his team did a fantastic job. I think it's a fantastic report. Shamilla, do you want to pick up the conversation on this?
Thank you, Peter. I think I will commend Shantanu on his assessment of the multilateral system in this particular regard. I think one of the biggest challenges facing scientists today is translating the actual scientific results into something concrete. We've seen recently that, for example, that water is so important in terms of the COVID, and that access to safe and clean drinking water is one of the best ways of combating the spread of the disease. After all, how can you combat spread if you don't have access to water simply to wash your hands? But that means you need safe water. So have we ever put science at the top of water? No. We put science elsewhere. Have we ever put science at the heart of post-harvest technologies? No. We put science in this illusionary capacity somewhere else, very abstract. So perhaps the role of scientists today is to translate the results and the impact of their work to relate to everyday life. And this is the biggest challenge we face today. How can we translate science into the language that people can understand and that would want our science? That is the only way then we can measure the impact. And this is also then the problem in the multilateral system, is to be able to speak to policymakers governments and perhaps the decision makers of what role science can play, and the central role to science. So do we need special indicators? Can we measure the impact of our interventions? Only then we will be able to really engage policymakers and scientists together to speak the same language and to understand that. COVID has shown us a sterling example of bringing together the world's population. Everybody, every child across the world knows that there is a virus. It's called COVID. It's affecting you and me. Here we see we are speaking one language, but how then can we manage that in the UN system when we have competing priorities, challenges across the world and world's populations? So this is the biggest challenge, I would say, for the UN system, to be able to bring all this together in a comprehensive way so that developmental challenges are met with.
I'm going to come to Zakri in a minute, but I can't help but responding at this point. And that is, of course, we've seen the emergence over the last 20 years of the concept of brokerage. That is, people who are skilled particularly at the interface between science and policy. Science advisors are one form of brokerage. Some academies are another form of brokerage. There are different ways of doing it. And perhaps one of the questions that I will put to Zakri in this context is, who's worked as a broker for many years in Malaysia, and of course was part of the previous Secretary General's interest in a science advisory mechanism, which obviously didn't work, is what you're begging for in a way is a form of brokerage system. The question is, what's on the other side of the brokerage system? What is the actual brokerage system? And then you've got, as you say, Shantanu, both the political and the technical sides of the UN system. So, Zakri, do you want to comment at this point?
Yes, first I'll just sympathize with Shantana's frustration of how the science has not come across to the policymakers. In fact, Shantana, this is an old problem that has been discussed at least 20 years, Peter. You know that. But as someone who worked as the science advisor to the Prime Minister, his requests were just simple. He said, I don't care what you do with science advice, but you give me two things. With your science advice, can you advance the socio-economic welfare of our people? Can science create jobs? And can science contain illnesses and diseases? So these are very simple. So we can just package that to the leaders. I think we'll get somewhere. There is ongoing process now, Peter. This is trying to get 30% of the Earth's surface and marine areas under protected areas by 2030. This is where we are at. And we are still looking around, but one of the mechanisms for that was a political body called High Ambition Coalition, co-chaired by France and Costa Rica, the president and the prime minister. So I think those kind of leadership has to come in. And scientists would have to do just that. You look at the IPCC mentioned several times. Nobody knows about it until Al Gore got into the act, right? So the IBPES, which I chaired, we tend to get smart. At one stage, 2 years ago, we met President Macron at his office in Paris. He said, I will champion this in his group. So my message, while we try to construct whatever mechanism that we have in mind, it is very important to chat up with the politicians and the top policymakers. And the other thing, Peter, you mentioned about the Scientific Advisory Board of Ban Ki-moon's when he was in office. it was a breakthrough, I think. I'm one of the 26. But as an insider, I know it's not going to work. First, the chair of the board is the bureaucrat from the UN, the executive director of UNESCO, Madam Bukova. There again, they become bureaucratic. Secondly, there was no funding which are being given to this body. So in a sense, it's just put aside. And if Guterres is not interested in it, I could understand why.
I think I want to come back to Shantanu's plea, I think, which was an important plea, which is the issue of integrating disciplines. That the reality is nothing is a pure social science issue, nothing's a pure natural science issue, nothing's a pure economic issue. They all interrelate in different ways. And I think and this is, I think, also where I think UNESCO could take some leadership too. What we're seeing is the emergence of a new kind of science, transdisciplinarity science, where the transdisciplinarity is defined that it starts with the outcome you want to change. So it doesn't start with the physicist or the chemist or the biologist or the sociologist. It starts with the question, with the outcome, and then it tries to frame where you're going from bringing the disciplines together to jointly frame the questions that need to be asked. And we've seen that emerging. I happen to direct a transdisciplinary think tank, so that's why I'm talking this language. But just 2 months ago, OECD pointed out that if we're going to address the wicked problems, the grand challenges, things that matter for the citizens of the world, we need to take a transdisciplinary approach. But that requires systems of organisation, like the GSDR tried to do. It requires funding mechanisms and it requires accountability mechanisms that are quite different to where we are now. It requires building up understandings of systems approaches to analysing a problem. And I think that's where I think the combination of UNESCO's skills in thinking about the different knowledge disciplines, DESA's skills in thinking about the outcome measures that matter over the next few years, and the skills of organisations such as INGSA and the International Science Council that look at the interface between policy, science and society could do a lot to shift the way science operates for more effective impact on the processes of decision-making, not just by the UN, but by governments and by societies as a whole. And I think there's a need for, and it may be an area where there's some really reflection on how best science can work in this transdisciplinary state. Might be something to reflect on beyond this meeting. Again, Zakri, you've thought about this a lot, I know.
Yes. It doesn't work to many extent because in some ways we tend to complicate life. I think one of the lessons learned is to make your message simple, you know. Even though the issue is complex, transdisciplinary, transsectoral, but how do you make your message simple? I think Shantanu mentioned about water, you know, that's a very close to everybody's heart. If we can just focus on that, I think we could get somewhere. One of the problems of the UN system for my years of participating in it, it's too large. Just like all those mega conferences that in 1992, 2002, you know, and 20, and Rio Plus 20. If we can dissect and make it simpler, maybe it will be better, you know.
So that leads me on to the next question, and that is, one of the inventions of, I think, coming out of UN-DESA was the TFM mechanism and the STI forum, which was not large, very small. It's only a few hundred people tend to come to the meeting. But in a sense, it's been more of just a stakeholder networking meeting. And I think the science community is still trying to understand how it can actually be more effectively engaged with the UN system, other than when it's invited, an individual scientist is invited to a meeting. Is there ways, do you think, that the TFM mechanism or the 10-member group that advises you through that mechanism could be improved? And similarly, I might ask Shamilla, is the UNESCO system sufficiently outreaching to the broader science community beyond what it does through its through its member state system?
Right. Thanks, Peter. Actually, before I get into the TFM, etc., let me just sort of first completely agree with everybody else here that one of the ways in which science enters the discussion is through the finding of solutions rather than just a research.
Exactly.
And the moment you start talking of solutions, you are actually talking of an engagement transdisciplinary, but you're also talking about multiple stakeholders.
Yep.
And so then the conversation has to be broadened in how to engage with these various stakeholders, not just on the basis of science, but also on the basis of what they bring, which may be non-scientific, strengths to the table. So whether it is the private sector, or whether it is citizens mobilizing around something, or whether young people thinking they can change behaviors, all of this starts becoming important in the solution space, because we know there are different ways to achieve solutions. And obviously in this day and age, we want solutions that have minimal sort of negative effects on the rest of the world. And for these to be achieved, I think one has to engage with a much broader community that goes beyond scientists and that places the work of science in the context of finding solutions. So having said that, I think we have to look at the mechanisms that were put forward in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, keeping this in mind. You already mentioned, and we spoke about the Global Sustainable Development Report, which is one way for scientists to engage in producing a transdisciplinary, but more or less consensual, maybe not fully so, view of how implementation can be advanced. The other one, of course, is the technology facilitation mechanism. And this has components such as the Science Technology Innovation Forum, but this is not the only component of the technology facilitation mechanism. This, I think, the much bigger and broader work of the technology facilitation mechanism is actually the coordination across all of the UN system entities that have an interest in science for sustainable development, including, of course, UNESCO, but 42 others, and also in connecting with people who are outside the UN system, in the private sector, in think tanks such as the OECD, in the International Science Council, INGSA, and so on, as a way to work towards focused objectives. And some of these objectives are around things like strengthening capacity on the ground in science policy advice, in a better understanding of how new technologies have socioeconomic and environmental impact. These are ongoing streams of work. In finding ways for solutions that have worked in one part of the world to become more readily available in other parts of the world. So I think the TFM operates much more concretely in sharing knowledge towards strengthening capacity and helping disseminate solutions. So it's a little bit different from what the GSDR actually does. I mean, I can come back to some of these issues later, but for now, over.
And what about the major group system? You know, the major science group system. Has that proved to be of much use to you, Shantanu, or is it something that could be more useful?
Right. And so, I mean, I don't know if people are completely familiar with the major groups, but this is sort of shorthand for something that happened at the first Rio summit in 1992, where the General Assembly or the member states decided that it wasn't enough to just have inputs from member states in these discussions, but actually to reach out to non-state actors in a systematic way. And there are 12 of these groups. One of them is science and technology. Then there are groups on children and youth, on women, on farmers, indigenous people. There's a whole list somewhere. So this has stayed with us over time. And I think the way it is very useful to us, but I think the way we kind of see this also is that these are actually networks of people across the world. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. And so, for example, when we are working in the context of, let us say, food security, we find it useful not just to use our own channels of science, the UN system and so on, but also to reach out through the major groups to say, well, we are working on food security right now, and we would like to have your inputs with maybe specific perspectives that you bring to the table. And so the scientific inputs for this come not just from the science and technology major group, but sometimes also from the children and youth major group. Or from the major group on women, who may bring a particular scientific expertise to the table. I think just to show that while there is a focused science and technology major group, the science is so widely prevalent in how people think and in how the other groups interact or work on issues, that quite often there is a complementary scientific input that comes in from some other group as well, not just the officially designated one. So I think one finds this extremely enriching for the work, and also it strengthens the work of the UN itself in making sure these kind of perspectives that are brought to the table in New York are also perspectives that are originating from the ground and are informing member states in their own way, in their own country context, before they actually come to the negotiation at the NOVA.
Shamilla, do you want to comment or pick up on this conversation about engaging the broader scientific community outside the formal process of the member state process?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for giving us this opportunity. I think it's UNESCO has a very particular mandate, as I mentioned, bringing together the different disciplines of science, but also the social scientists, the educators, the learners, the different communities, even the communication information sector. So we have seen, I would like to highlight two very important initiatives that we have ongoing right now, which is really a true demonstration of where we're reaching out to multi-stakeholders. And that is in the development of a UNESCO recommendation for open science.
Yes.
This recommendation for open science will be the only recommendation in the whole UN system which intends to reverse the knowledge gap that we see right now between the developing countries and even among the groups. Now, the 193 member states last year called upon UNESCO to build a consensus for an open science recommendation. But this open science recommendation would also mean that we have to reach out to different communities. We have to reach out to the scientists, to the journalists, the publishers. We have to reach out to people who access science online. We have to reach out to repositories of science, intellectual property owners, the different stakeholders, even at national level, who may not necessarily be linked with the scientific community. And I think that is the beauty of this work of UNESCO in bringing together these different stakeholders. We've had a number of different meetings and consultations. We have set up an international scientific advisory committee, which is made up of all the disciplines, totally unrelated even to science. Historians are also part of this group. So this is the manner in which UNESCO can reach out through its mandate. and bring on board this consensus building for science, society, and policy. And perhaps that is this recommendation which we would like to bring forward, since the world scientific community come together to show that science is beyond borders, beyond patent trolls, and also beyond publications. And this is the spirit of this open science movement. But I would also like to build on what Professor Zakri was talking about in terms of biodiversity and the call for the High Coalition, the call across the world to build this coalition. I think it's very important right now to understand the repercussions of this disequilibrium of living in harmony with nature. What has happened? We've seen the increase in zoonotic diseases from SARS to Ebola, now to the coronavirus. That's not just the impact of climate change, but biodiversity loss. And we have in UNESCO since 50 years, and the celebrations will be next year, for the Man and the Biosphere program, where we can show that we don't need to have just 30% of the world in a protected, conserved area. We all need to live in harmony with nature. We see trees, plants, and animals. We can demonstrate that we can conserve, protect, and restore our common shared value for nature. And this means bringing together the geoscientists, the botanists, the zoologists, the social scientists, natural scientists, all together to understand what is the impact of nature on the world today, on our life, on socio-economic development, and how we can live in harmony with each other through shared common values. And that is how UNESCO can reach out beyond the natural science population, but to other constituencies across the world. And this is the systems thinking. Whether it's transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, this is really a systems thinking for problem solving. And this is UNESCO's added value. Thank you.
I must say, I think we have a problem of a word, and that word is science. Because I think too often we go back and thinking science is just about natural science. And I think it's unfortunate that English doesn't have a word closer to the German Wissenschaft, which actually points out that all the knowledge disciplines actually have to work together, that the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the normative humanities are all part of the same knowledge framework. And I think that it's important that as we move ahead, we don't fall into the trap of thinking about science as natural sciences. In my experience as a decade of being a chief science advisor, even though I come originally from a natural science background, the bulk of the work I was doing was at the social science and even at the normative humanities end of the spectrum. It was not at the hardcore natural science end. So I think there is a language problem in English, which the Germans have solved, and presumably some other languages have as well, but English has a particular problem with. I do think, and I'll come to Zakri in a moment, that both of you have raised an interesting issue in my mind. Both of you have pointed out, and I fully agree with you, that the sciences need to be in many ways, without in any way diminishing the importance of basic science, a large bulk of the scientific community needs to be much more outcome focused, where the world's challenges lie. Equally, I think if I look at the scientific community, many of them would be unaware of the level of effort that goes in the multilateral community in these areas. And I just think there's a need somewhere, and maybe it's the role of the International Science Council and the major group as the bridge, to actually look at ways of better communicating between the bulk of the science community, where the issues are, where the opportunities are, and where the technocratic and policy communities see at the multilateral level cooperation is needed. I think there's something there that we might want to reflect upon. I want to move to the third point, to another point though, which I think is at the heart of the difficulties of this conversation. And that is, at the end of the day, while the UN system, the multilateral system, can do certain things, the bulk of the policy decisions are actually made by member states, by at the jurisdictional level of a member state, or even at a sub-jurisdictional level in a federal system. And one of the things that I think Zakri and I have spent the last 5-6 years working together on is the issue of trying to build the capacity at the interface, not at the UN level, but at the member state level. Because I wonder if that's not the real difficulty from your perspective. We can all work, and we do work, and certainly the agencies work on high-level documents, like the various things around the sustainability agenda. But in the end, it ultimately comes down to what a member state does. And if the brokerage and evidence synthesis system is not working at a member state level, are you compromised in what you can achieve? I'm going to reverse it and ask Zakri if he thinks that the real effort needs to be at the level of the member state rather than the level of the UN.
We cannot ignore the general member states discourse. I think that would go on in the UN, in the General Assembly, or in the different treaties. But your suggestion about deep diving on some of the issues at the regional level, from our experience in INGSA, it has been very productive. And people are not turned off because they feel comfortable. Because some of the case studies that we shared are those problems that they're facing day to day as a policymaker. So I think, Peter, in that sense, we should proceed, if not replicate that in other areas. So in ASEAN, we are trying our best. Secondly, I want to go back to this this group, the weather group that you mentioned. In fact, it was at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 1992. Your predecessor, IGSU, had done an excellent job of churning out small booklets to educate the delegates. I think has been useful. That is one mechanism, one approach which we should seriously consider, Peter, through the International Science Council. And in that too, we know very well, science is not just natural science, but the social sciences. In other words, if I just conclude, I am a student also of bottom-down approach, but respecting the top-down. We need both, So that is the essence of science policy interface. We connect. Yeah.
So thanks, Zakri. So Shantanu, do you have a view? I remember I think it was the 2017 TFM STI forum. There was discussion of whether and I think it came through in the 10-member group report as well, that the UN should encourage the development of science advisory mechanisms in member states. Has that ever had any further traction within the UN system?
Yes, Peter, I think this is something that actually through the TFM, a fair amount of work has been underway since the last year. And there has been a lot of interest in actually seeing what's a systematic way of bringing science and technology together at the country level to address SDG challenges. And so the umbrella term for this in our work is we refer to these as roadmaps for implementing STI for the SDGs, or bringing together STI for the SDGs. And we have a number of pilot countries where this work is underway. Of course, now immediately the perspectives or the circumstances of each country are different. But I think we find also a few common principles, one of which is the transdisciplinarity idea that you spoke about earlier, which I think comes in very naturally when we talk about solutions. The other is the need to engage with multiple stakeholders. And I think there are two other things that we haven't spoken about yet here, which we find important in this roadmaps work. The first is, I think we've moved a long way since the 50s and 60s and 70s even, when, science policy was a closed discussion in the planning commission of a country or in the national research lab somewhere or the other. To some extent, yes, this still is relevant, but I think it's very important, the broader engagement with society, including, I think, increasingly societal actors who are skeptical about science, or who need to be persuaded on their own terms about the importance of a particular approach. I think this is increasingly important, and I fear not something we do at a sufficient level of skill. So we find in this work on roadmaps, this is important. And the final point I would say is that, we do talk about transdisciplinarity, etc., but we also have to figure out what are the incentives for scientists to do this work.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, especially if you're a young person full of bright ideas, but also trying to get tenure, you will probably get it not by being terribly transdisciplinary, but being very disciplinary.
You've highlighted,
that's how the peer process works.
You've highlighted, I think, a huge challenge that the science system itself needs to evolve, and that requires multiple actors: academies, governments, funders, universities, policy communities, all need to work out how to move in harmony, because the science system, as Shamilla said, is so global that the culture has a global element to it. And it's a huge issue, which I think is right at the heart of much ahead of us. Shamilla, do you want to comment? You looked...
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think I would agree with you that it is global, yes. But then you've touched on a very sensitive point, and that is that because it's global, and this goes back to what Zakri was talking about, the multilateral system, because problems are global and globalized, we need one another. And that is why we need the UN system to ensure that nobody is left behind, because no small island, for example, in the Pacific Island countries, can develop its own science system, fully fledged scientific community in all the disciplines, universities. And that is why we need the UN system to promote this international cooperation. Science is not a flash in the pan. Science communities are not born overnight. Investing in science community is a fruitful, long collaboration. And now we see that the low status of researchers is of great concern to policymakers. And that is why we call the researchers, they are the canary in the mine. This pandemic has shown us that with this unprecedented health emergency, governments are turning to scientific communities everywhere. What would be the next lockdown? How would we go back into confinement? How would we deconfine populations? How many numbers are there? What is the role of the PCR machines? Who are the scientists to manage this? So there is support for public research also to be engaged across the world. And this is important.
That brings me back to the question
please.
I was really trying to ask Shantanu, which was, as we've seen in the work that INGSA is leading and has reported somewhat earlier this week, that we're seeing very diverse capacities for science to formally integrate into the decision-making of government, even in the position of the pandemic and the emergency. If that is the canary in the mine, to use Shamilla's metaphor, for the broader issues of how science informs policy, then we've got large gaps in most member states. Now, it's not just the process, clearly it's the actors themselves. I mean, we've seen countries, we have to be very honest and say there have been countries that on paper had very good mechanisms, but it does look as if the attributes of the individuals, both on the policy side and on the scientific side have to be appropriate for the connection to really work. But I do think that what the INGSA work is showing is the necessary to be pre-prepared. That you need to have systems in place to be able to call on the science community in a timely and appropriate and pluralistic manner. And it's that plurality of disciplines, which I think we all agree on is so important. You're not going to solve COVID through mathematical modeling alone. You need many other skills involved as well. And I think, and the policymakers need to have access to that range of knowledge. And that's where I think bulk of the work this week in the INGSA dialogue has been about, is how can we input that knowledge to the policy decision making, which is distinct in a sense from the decisions made about what science a country needs to do for itself. But, how does that knowledge get in an appropriate way with integrity into the mechanisms? And I think all of us would agree that is, policy making is always going to have many more elements to it than scientific knowledge. But better policy making is more likely if the scientific knowledge is available in an appropriate and accessible way to the policymaker and to the community, because at the end of the day, communities determine in many ways what the political community does. So I think the issues that I think one of you raised about the misinformation age, about the problems of dealing with the anti-science movement, which will clearly explode in the next 12 months around anti-vax, but it can be about climate change denial, it can be about many other things as well. But it's a real challenge for all of us who are interested in advancing sustainability and human development to make sure that knowledge is not undermined and knowledge is used appropriately. We're coming towards the end of a very fruitful conversation. I just wonder whether each of you would like to make some final comments about science, its role, any reflections in particular that might have come out of the experience of COVID that might have generalization for thinking about science, the international community, and society in general moving ahead. Shamilla?
I see you put me on the spot, Peter.
I like doing that.
Thank you. I think one parting word from UNESCO would be that today we bear witness to the convening soft power of science. And this soft power is uniting nations, scientists, civil society, private sector, and the world at large. And it really epitomizes evidence-based decision-making. We not only need open, accessible science, we need understandable science. And we need science in all its realms, and so that it will be able to really contribute to our development today. But this scientific humanism in a troubled world is really at the heart of all UNESCO's programs and the open science recommendation, which is in preparation right now. But I think one parting word is also that a disaster of this magnitude reminds us that there is strength in us, that we are stronger as a group than as individuals. That matter how powerful an individual country is, it remains vulnerable to a pandemic. In a globalized world, we need each other. Today, we need more science, better science, inclusive science. And we need to harness all the talent on the world, all the different sciences, so that we ensure that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Well, we're not going to close there, but there was a great closing comment, because I want to ask Zakri if he would like to make some final comments.
Yes, I think COVID-19 is catastrophic, but at the same time, it provides an opportunity for science to exert its influence. For a long time, science has not been seriously taken. But COVID-19, I think, has turned it around. And this is a chance for the scientific community to seize the moment and stress about the importance of science and technology. Secondly, just on this, is a big world. While we quickly chasing of the vaccine and all that, we must also remind ourselves the bigger world, the inequity which affect a big chunk of the globe. So the UN, I think, is a system which can try to take into account and reduce the inequality. Thank you.
Shantanu.
Thanks, Peter. I don't think I can top that, but let me offer three thoughts. The first is that, what COVID has really brought to the fore for all of us is unity, diversity, and continuity. And I would say the unity part is where we talk about recognizing that the global scientific research agenda is really a global public good. And it is meant to support not just one country or one group of countries, but all countries in building up preparedness and in building up response capacity. And it should be funded and treated as such, not as one national good, but as a global public good. So I think this is where the unification idea of COVID we have to take to heart and put it at the center of how we respond to sustainability challenges. The second point is about diversity. And I think, again, with COVID, we see that it is correct that diverse approaches and different solutions crop up in unexpected places. But there has to be a deliberate effort in disseminating them across the world. For example, I'll give you a very straightforward example. I'm not a medical health professional, but if you travel to Southeast Asia after SARS, you would have seen everybody wearing masks. And it was well understood that, you didn't have to be a medical professional for a simple face covering to stop the transmission. And if you look at New York City today, the incidence of mask wearing is highest in the region of Flushing, which is full of people who have experienced SARS either directly or through their families, weakest in places where this information, where this direct experience has not happened. And I think when there is diversity across the world in how people approach problems and solve them, there is a role for something pan-national like the UN, like INGSA, like ICSU, to make this knowledge available, accessible, and usable in all parts of the world in a persuasive way. So this is where I think the diversity part of how we think about COVID is important. And finally, I would like to say continuity. And I'm saying continuity because, during COVID, we have ad hoc structures cropping up. We have various kinds of things cropping up just to deal with COVID. But building the relationship with the public is a long-term process. And we should not be jumping into it to address an issue and then back away from the public when that issue is done. So whether this is at the country level or at the global level, the systematic structure, the continuity, and the building the coalitions that are active in non-stressful times will be what get us through stressful times. And so I would say that unity, diversity, and continuity are what we should take away from the science kind of discussion when we think of COVID. Over.
Well, thanks, Shantanu, because I think that last point is really the starting point in many ways for the way INGSA is thinking about it. Because I think it is actually saying countries have had to build ad hoc science advisory mechanisms to deal with COVID. Can they not learn from that to think about using similar approaches or the same approach to deal with all the other challenges that are represented within the sustainability agenda? And I think it's so important in another way, because I think, as the Secretary General has pointed out with his Build Back Better line, the issues of many countries are thinking this is a chance to renew and accelerate movement on the human development and sustainability agendas. And I think that's something that the science community would welcome. And you use one set of words which resonate with me very well. Science is a global public good. And I think that that is actually in the slogan of the International Science Council as in its mission statement, that it promotes science as a global good. And I think we've been privileged here today to have Shantanu representing, if you like, the central elements of the UN system, Shamilla representing the scientific organisation of the UN, the organisation of the UN with S in its agenda and who does so much to integrate science. And I think Zakri and myself representing the international science community between INGSA and the International Science Council. They're the three arms that do have a good relationship, but I think we can work better over coming years to actually, from each of our responsibilities, us from this, to actually advance this agenda faster. So I'd like to thank all of you for being involved. And I'd just say to the audience, this is the last event of our week to replace the meeting in Montreal, which COVID interrupted. But please stay engaged with INGSA. The website is www.ingsa.org. If you're not a member, please join now. And we look forward to you engaging with us over coming months and hopefully meeting with you next year. Thank you, Shantanu. Thank you, Zakri. And particularly thank you, Shamilla, for doing this as the first event on your having come back from a few days off. So thank you very much and good night.